Okay, let's get started. Welcome, everybody. Really excited to see you all, and thank you for joining us today for this vital webinar about AI and environmental justice. Um, I am Michael Gelobter. I'm the director of the Yale Center for Environmental Justice, and I've been at Yale for about 2.5 years. Been working on environmental justice since the mid-'80s and on climate change also since the mid-'80s. I'm really excited to be joined today by Jon Koomey and Justin Pearson. We may get a cameo appearance towards the end from Charles Hua, who will be featured on a future webinar about how to take action on what we're talking about today. Our goal today really is to just explore issues that are frankly endangering communities around the US and around the world, the ways in which the speed and rate of deployment of AI poses a threat to our communities in conventional ways, in terms of siting and permitting and things like that, and in unconventional ways as well. So frankly, the Yale Center for Environmental Justice has been spent a fair amount of time over the last couple of years in response to requests from our member community. Let me just talk to you a little bit about, can I share a screen? I'll share my screen as well, Axel, just a second. Um, the, the Yale Center for Environmental Justice is based at Yale University. We are split between the Environment School and the law school, and the Center for Race, Ethnicity, and Transnational Migration. Our faculty leader is Gerald Torres. I'm the executive director. Our Indigenous programs are run by Chuck Sams, who just recently stepped down as the head of the National Park Service. Corinne Green helps us manage day to day. Sinafekesh Girma runs our climate migration program. We have a program on that. Jim Diamond also works on our indigenous programs. And Asha Brundage-Moore runs our new collaborative clinic for nonprofit viability, which is focused on organizational defense, helping EJ and indigenous organizations stay viable in this era. We started working on AI in response to requests from communities in Connecticut to help build power for community organizers. I'm going to show you a couple of the things we're doing, but really critically, we are at this point one of the few people in the world building one of the few organizations in the world building products to build power with AI. We build AI to build community power. Even on the issue of climate change, we don't need a lot of artificial intelligence. We have the technologies already in place to solve climate change. We just can't deploy them. What we're missing is the power of people and communities to stop the fossil fuel industry and to shift into a decarbonized economy. So we've been focusing a lot on building tools for communities and for building power. I'll give you a quick preview of some of those, but one of the reasons we convene this call is because there are a lot of concerns about the uses of AI that our partners and people in the field have, and we wanted to really talk about them, address them. And this call is really meant to share two of the leaders in that work, Jon Koomey and Justin Pearson, who I'll introduce in a moment, and then engage with questions from you all and have some discussion from some of the people on the call who are engaged in working around AI as we speak as well. And we may have an ongoing series of webinars where we're talking to different academic groups and others to kind of go deeper into solutions and how folks can organize around these issues. Our work started, and I'll do this fairly quickly. We created a tool for organizers in Connecticut called the Connecticut EJ Advisor. One component of that tool was to help communities write comment letters on siting decisions in Connecticut, and we built this about 1.5 years ago. I'm not going to demo it so much as just show you what people can do is choose a docket element from a very opaque siting process in Connecticut called the Connecticut Siting Council. They can then write their concerns in plain English and get a formally written comment letter that reflects their concerns to send into the Siting Council. And this gives them legal standing in siting decisions in Connecticut based on concerns expressed in pretty much lay language. You can see here they say, I'm concerned about the electromagnetic radiation from these power lines that I live near. With the entrance of the new administration, we shifted to focus as well on federal rulemaking, so that communities could be part of the formal rulemaking processes and changes that might be underway. We built a tool specifically around the endangerment finding, which seeks to roll back the federal laws around climate regulation. And you can see here that someone writes, climate change and greenhouse gases have a major impact on the health of the elders in my community who are vulnerable to extreme heat. Please keep this finding strong. And then you can hit draft comment letter. We'll come back to that. Anyway, it drafts a comment letter. I can't demo it for you right now, I guess. It drafts a formal comment letter for people to submit to the Federal Register on this finding. But by the way, the comments on this finding are presently closed. But it does a similar thing where it gives communities, and this is really, this tool is built as a widget, as a widget generator. So Yale is not doing this. This is communities can come and download this tool, customize it to the issues they're concerned about, and deploy it on their own websites and have it be owned by their own communities. We also have built a tool for more global use in contexts where decision-making is not as structured as it is in Europe and the United States. This whole page you're looking at was generated by an AI based on a request from a community in Eastern Mumbai that is regularly flooded in new climate change events. And basically they say, hey, there's this event that happened. It happened in our community. We need information to work on it. And the AI then generates a resource, an AI that's built specifically for that community that covers what happened, what caused it, who are the key decision makers, and what are the commitments that those decision makers have made to date. So it's like the beginning of an organizer's manual or a community manual for engaging with the threats that they face. This tool is just rolled out. We're testing these things with just small numbers of communities. And one of the things we'll ask for at the end of this call is those people both in the United States and overseas who are interested in working with us to perfect these tools. As you can see in India, this tool is also available in two other languages, Hindi and Marathi, which are the two other dominant languages in the Mumbai area. This tool works by scraping local media, news reports, government statements to assemble a referenceable list of things that have happened that community organizers in the face of these kinds of disasters and pressures can utilize to start mobilizing action. So we're really excited to get feedback on these things and particularly to get test users. But most importantly for this call, we're excited to talk about AI itself as an issue for environmental justice and to get really people's views, having discussions or contributing to some of the discussions around how AI is a risk to communities in a variety of ways. So with that, I want to turn to, I will stop sharing my screen somehow. I'm sorry, I have to figure out how to get to that button. Axel, can you take that back from me? Or I'll just close this window. You got it. Thank you, Axel. So hi everyone. We're joined today by Jon Koomey and Justin Pearson. Jon actually and I got our PhDs together at the Energy and Resources Group a long time ago. Jon is really world-renowned, honestly, probably as the leading expert in the world on the energy use of technology and data centers. He's very famous for something called Koomey's Law, which is that like Moore's Law, but different, that the efficiency of data transmission in data centers is doubling every 2 years. I'll let him be more precise than that, but that's roughly it. But I can tell you that in tech, it is an ironclad law that Jon invented. And he'll be talking to us some about the technology sides of this. And Justin Pearson, who is one of our great leaders in Tennessee and one of the leaders in the fight against XAI. The theme of this call is false narratives and false urgency. As an energy person myself, and Jon will talk to you about this. I'm really concerned about how much people are being forced to take on AI as opposed to citing and energy decisions and energy pricing decisions, which are really where the damage is being inflicted. And that in many ways, the fossil fuel industry and the nuclear industry are using AI as a stalking horse to say, hey, oh my God, we have to burn, baby, burn, because of AI. And that risks a lot. So I'll just start with a quote, a recent headline from Fortune magazine, but Sam Altman says Sam Altman's AI empire will devour as much power as New York City and San Diego combined. Experts say it's scary. We've all seen these headlines. So Jon, what's going on with these energy and water claims? Are they correct? Is the drastic demand these individuals and AI companies are pushing for supported by the research?
Thanks, Michael. I think the most important thing is to kind of step back and think about the context. There's a general narrative that we see in the news about explosive demand growth, how it's really increasing electricity use, electricity prices. It turns out that this is not happening at the national level. it is a regional story. And so that's one important piece of context, is that you hear about explosive demand growth, but it's only happening in a few places where there are a lot of data centers. And so it's really important for people to understand that. Axel, are you able to share the screen?
Yes.
So I worked on a report with the Bipartisan Policy Center, which came out earlier this year, and it's a report that kind of, we call it a guide for the perplexed, because there's a lot of misinformation floating around out there, as Michael intimated. So at the national level for the US, there is no explosive demand growth. So this is the plot of electricity use, primary energy consumption, and GDP over time. Everything is expressed as an index. 1973 is 100. What you can see is that electricity consumption has been growing very slowly in the last 20-ish years. And most people don't realize this, but 2023, actually, there was less electricity use than in 2022. In 2024, it's up about 2.2% for the US as a whole. So that's modest growth. And you can see it kind of bounces around over the years because it varies by changes in the weather, it varies by economic activity, and so on. So at the national level, there is no crisis, there is no explosive demand growth. So that's the first important piece of context. Should we go to the next one? Another piece of context is that data centers are growing and have been growing in the last 6 to 8 years in terms of the amount of electricity they consume, but they're only part of uh, demand growth, likely demand growth going forward. And so we have electrification of vehicles that's happening in the US. In September, about 10% of light vehicles were electric. You're also seeing in other countries it's happening much faster. In California, it's happening much faster. But that's certainly a significant contributor. Industry is electrifying. Buildings are electrifying as people switch to heat pumps. So data centers, we think, based on the most optimistic forecast from the Electric Power Research Institute, data centers might be contributing over the next 5 years about a quarter of the projected demand growth. So what we're talking about here is, again, not explosive growth, even when you consider the other potential contributors to growth. We're talking about growth in the kind of 2 to 3% per year range, which historically the industry has managed very, very well. So it's not a crisis. There's no explosive demand growth, and data centers are one part of potential demand growth in the next 5 years, but they're not the most, they're a significant contributor, but they're one of several contributors. And so that's a more important context. Now, the next slide shows you something about a local situation. So on the y-axis is growth in megawatt, of electricity use, peak demand in megawatts for Dominion, Virginia. And it shows projections by PJM, which is the big utility that has Dominion, Virginia underneath it. And what it shows is there's a projection in 2019, that's that blue line. 2020 is that light green line. 2021 is a little lower, that's gray. In 2022, there's an increase in that projection. And then in 2023, the dotted line is a big increase. And so these are projections by the utility, because this is the place that is expecting very substantial demand growth locally for data centers. So one thing, when you see graphs like this, it's important to understand that these reflect the expectations of the utility. They don't necessarily reflect reality. And so these expectations are set in part by the tech companies expressing interest to the utilities about individual data center projects. And so they will go to a utility and they'll say, this is the project that we're thinking of building. Here are the details about it. What can you do for us in terms of rates and uh, the speed of getting the connection and all that stuff. And so they get into the interconnection queue. Typically, it doesn't cost anything to do that. And so they do that, and the utility says, oh, this is the project, so we're going to put it into our forecast. The problem is that the data center company is doing it for many utilities because they don't know where the best place is to build their facility. And they're going to check out, as any good shopper would do, they're going to try to find the best place to build their facility. But what happens is that there's huge double counting. If you look at the national level, you think about this, there's huge double counting in terms of these projections. So it's important for people to understand that these projections are not reality and that they're driven in part by an double counting of potential projects that may or may not come to pass. A friend of mine works at the California Public Utilities Commission. They actually went pretty far down the path towards approving this data center, and then they decided to move to Nevada, or to put it in Nevada. And so this happens all the time. So this is an important context that most people don't realize. Let's go to the next one. So this is again in Virginia. There's a lot of lines here, but we've got electricity generation, or use, actually, electricity use on the y-axis, and then time on the x-axis. So here's the important takeaway here. So the purple line, that's industrial electricity use. The residential line is green. Both of those are flat. Not much growth happening. The orange line is the total commercial sector. So that's office buildings and other facilities like that. And data centers are in the commercial sector. And what you can see, data centers are split out in red. They are contributing virtually all of the growth in the commercial sector. So in Virginia, the expectation is all the growth is data centers. Now, that might not come to pass, but Virginia is the largest concentration of data centers anywhere in the US, at least. So it's not surprising that there's growth, and they're pretty sophisticated in how they assess potential projects and so on. But we're definitely seeing it for certain places, significant expected growth because of data centers. We're seeing it in Virginia, we're seeing it in Georgia, we're seeing it in Texas. But again, it's not a national phenomenon. It's a more local phenomenon. Another piece of context to understand is, for the US, all data centers use 4.4% of US electricity in 2023. And that's from a report that I worked on with Lawrence Berkeley Lab that came out in December. So that's the kind of, it's starting from a relatively small base, definitely growing. And but there are questions, of course, about how much it will grow. And I can talk a little bit about that. Do we have is there another slide on this? Okay, not on this one. Okay, so let me just talk about it conceptually about demand growth, and then I'll turn it over to Justin, because he's got some really interesting stories to tell about local effects of people trying to push through projects like this. So growth in AI is a function of two things. One is the expectation for the growth in service demand. How much compute do we expect to use from AI? And it's also a function of how fast do we improve the efficiency of AI. There's uncertainty on both of those things, and on the demand growth side, you've got uncertainty about legal issues, copyright. You've got uncertainty about accuracy. You've got uncertainty about liability. You really have a lot of things for people to think about. The current conventional wisdom assumes that there's essentially infinite demand for AI. Basically, we can't possibly build as much AI as people are going to demand. That could be true, but nobody really knows for sure. And because of those issues around accuracy, AI telling you to eat rocks and put glue in your pizza, these are things that might give people some pause. There are certainly uses of it, but the question of whether it will be AI everywhere is really, to me, an unresolved question that we don't have the answer to. So I think the expectations on the demand side are, on the demand for AIs are big. And then on the efficiency side, there's all sorts of ways to deliver compute. And the current crop of AI models basically assumes that scaling these models, bigger data, this will be the way that we'll get improvements in AI in terms of accuracy and other things. That's been true historically, but the question of whether that's true going forward is, again, an open question that people don't know. About 6 months ago, a company called DeepSeek created a model that was kind of a lightweight model that was used cleverness instead of scale, and they they didn't have the big fast computers, so they had to come up with other ways to do it. And it's 10 or 100 times cheaper and faster and better than the big models and giving comparable accuracy. So again, there's huge potential on the efficiency side. It may be true that people decide we don't need those giant models for everything, we just need them for certain things, and that we use these lightweight models that are much less compute intensive to solve the problems that we have. So those two uncertainties make me pretty confident that the conventional wisdom view of massive growth in AI use and then massive growth in AI electricity use are probably overblown. With that, I will turn it back to Justin and Michael.
Great. Let me just introduce Justin. Thank you, Jon, for that. I'll make a couple more points after Justin's saying about the context, about the broader environmental context also around these kinds of claims. But basically, I spent 4 years working at Google and 10, 12 years doing clean tech software in the Valley, in a world, particularly early in my time, where Elon Musk was, a hero, right? Had invented electric cars, had shared patents, opened the patents to electric vehicles in ways that grew the industry quickly, seemed to be coming from the right place. And I can tell you right now, I live in a world of two really radically different narratives. One is he built the largest AI facility in the world in 4 months. And people are just like, holy shit, look at him. There he goes again. And on the other hand, he built it in the communities that Justin represents in an environmentally and socially horrific way. So when AI urgency takes over regulators and legislators, it's communities on the ground that are most impacted by this kind of hysteria, this heroism, this fight China on AI, all this stuff. And in Memphis, particularly, XAI has literally deployed the largest supercomputing and AI facility in the world. People say things like, it would take 24 months to build. They built it in 4 months. So, and I know some about what's on the ground there. Justin lives it every day. So Justin, can you walk us through how Musk's company came to end up at this site and the immediate impacts it started having on the local community? And then we'll actually ask you to bridge from there to kind of what you've been doing about it, but maybe just describe what's going on first a bit for people. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Michael and Jonathan. I mean, amazing presentation, and thank you for the education that you're giving, that you're doing. Hey, everybody, I'm Rep. Justin J. Pearson. Really grateful to be here with you. I represent District 86, which is in Memphis and Shelby County, and I live 3 miles away from the XAI facility. And so it isn't just that it impacts my constituents here in Westwood and Southwest Memphis, and the implications have been pretty difficult and challenging, and in some situations dire for folks here. Musk and hit with the Memphis Chamber of Commerce. They started discussions about bringing the supercomputer into our city, and it was in June 4th of last year that the deal was announced by the chamber and by XAI. The mayor was not even invited to the press conference when it was announced. Immediately, they started work at an old facility that used to house a company called Electrolux, who made appliances, but offshored their jobs after they got some tax benefits from our city. And because they had purchased the property by right, we were told that they did not have to go through other regulations that required public input. And ultimately, the consequences of this was that they built 35 gas turbines to power the supercomputer illegally, without any approval from the Environmental Protection Agency or the Shelby County Health Department. And the health department didn't do anything to hold them accountable. A lot of resistance built up, and ultimately they were forced to apply for permits for 15 of those gas turbines, and they were made to have selective catalytic reduction technology on them. But that is not how it started. And the levels of pollution were so bad that it was double the amount of nitrogen oxide from the international airport, and it was about 17 tons per mile, 17.2 tons of formaldehyde pumped into the air as well, all without a single permit for their first year of operations.
Yeah, I'm just it's just stunning. What I've heard, Justin, that you said 45 generators. I mean, I've heard that one of the things they were doing was just turning them off every once in a while just to fall under a regulatory threshold. What are some of the strategies that, I mean, I think a lot of communities are facing increased energy prices, increased challenges to infrastructure. There was a story in the New York Times about Meta's use of water in Georgia. If you read that story carefully, it wasn't about quantity. It was about speed with which they put the infrastructure in, and they silted up everybody's water lines. They didn't use up all the water; they just clogged them by building with no permits and building poorly. What are some of the loopholes that, I mean, and I think XAI is an extreme case, but what are some of the loopholes that they were using on the ground there?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the worst loopholes that they use that was accepted by the mayor of Memphis, the mayor of Shelby County, was accepted by the health department even, was that they had a 1 year exemption before anyone could demand that they get a permit. That for 1 year, they could build as much and pollute as much as they would like, and no one could tell them anything. Now, if you wanted to build a fence around your home, you'd have to get a permit. But somehow you could build a gas plant in the center of a city, and you need no paperwork, no piece of paper from anyone at all to allow for that to happen. And unfortunately, the mayor of Memphis said, "Yeah, that makes sense." The mayor of the county, Lee Harris, he said, "Yeah, that's fine." Who's actually responsible for the health department, and the health department ultimately agreed that they get a 364-day exemption from any permitting requirements. And so one of the scarier things is that we see our democratic lowercase d institutions failing. And when this happens, the protections that are supposed to happen for the public no longer are there. So our health department was supposed to protect us. Our elected officials were supposed to protect us. They were supposed to use their bully pulpit to make the company do something if they wouldn't do it through regulations as they should have otherwise. But that didn't happen. And because so many places that they are going, and John, you're mentioning this, they're going to places that are easily exploitable politically and that are economically strangulated already. So a lot of our people, 22% of our people, live in poverty in this district. 37.2% of the children live underneath the poverty line. And so when they say, well, we're going to bring you tax money, we're not going to bring you any jobs, we're not going to improve the infrastructure, but we will bring tax money that we've yet to receive. That becomes the carrot for so many elected officials to say, well, let them do whatever they want and leave them alone and don't make a lot of noise about it. Just accept all the bad things and it maybe one day they'll fix it. And that's what we're dealing with. And so I to your point, I don't know if they did this, but it makes total sense. They're going to try and turn off the machines for a little bit to go underneath some threshold, and then they'll turn them back on. They have to report the pollution, right, to the health department. The health department doesn't even have an air quality monitor near the site. The nearest one is over 15 miles away. That is another very intentional act that has existed for decades. Because again, we're in what Dr. Mustafa Santiago Lee calls, right, like a sacrifice zone. It's a community that historically has faced the injustices, whether it's our pipeline fight, the Tennessee Valley Authority, Valero Oil Refinery. Companies have exploited our community, exploited our air, and XAI and Elon Musk, they're just looking at that playbook and replicating it. And that's what's dangerous, that's what's harmful, and that's what we're seeing happen here.
So can I add just one little piece of context for the audience? Regulation of utilities is mostly state level in the US, and then there are local regulations about air quality and nuisances and so on. And one of the things you see is a lot of variation in the way states regulate these kind of installations. And again, as you both were saying, XAI is kind of an extreme case, but you have a real imbalance of power between these big companies who are really, they basically have all the money in the world, and then these local or state officials who don't necessarily have the same, they don't have the kind of staff or number of staff that they would need to really kind of address these issues. So part of the story here is that regulation is at the state and local level, and there's a huge power imbalance between these giant wealthy companies and the people who are supposed to be holding them to account. And that's
Mhm.
it varies a lot. There are some states that are pretty good, but in terms of regulating in a rational way, but in a lot of places, this power imbalance really does tilt the playing field significantly, as Justin, you were saying.
But that's why the community organizing aspect is so important. Like our communities need to be prepared for this. We had the NAACP here a couple of weeks ago for a convening of over 80 community members and partners across the country who are dealing with data centers to come up with guiding principles. We need to talk to elected officials in our communities to say, what's our plan for when they come? Is there a special use permit that we can have that gives us some control, some ability to say yes, to say no, to create the parameters for which they could use our electricity or use our water? We need to prepare ourselves with the expectation that they are coming. And simultaneously, I think for most regular folk, we're trying to figure out, why do I need something that can write my email for me? Right? Like how much of this that we're being told is now necessary, right, is really for the bottom line of billionaires who are really fighting amongst each other.
Yeah, and that's really one of the things that has troubled me about this whole episode in the last few years is that I feel like it's being driven by other things. It's not being
Mhm.
driven by valuable software delivered to users to help them. It's being driven by the fact that these companies would love to collect more data on us. And
Mhm.
so if that's anytime something's being driven by an unstated motive, it always makes me nervous. It makes me think, well, what else are they trying to, you know, talk to me about or get away with? And so I think it's really important for people to understand. This is why that word urgency is in the title of this conversation, is that there's a sense of urgency that's been created by the tech industry, it's been created by the utility industry, and the real question we all need to ask ourselves is why? What's urgent? Do we really need to abandon environmental goals to get this new technology? Why can't it wait a couple of years so we can build a bunch of renewables and batteries? So it's really there are questions like that I think are mainly unaddressed in these conversations that I think people need to start thinking about. Where does this urgency come from, and is it really in the best interests of society to rush to do this and abandon environmental goals and put power plants in vulnerable communities? I just don't understand why we should do that.
Yeah. Let me say, I just having worked in the industry myself a bit, there is definitely a race, quote unquote, between the big companies to see who can get to, generalized artificial intelligence, and people cast it as a national security thing as well. This doesn't mean the services that we need. So they're rushing to get some kind of definitive technological edge for their company, perhaps
Right,
for our nation. But the
right.
uses are very diverse. The DeepSeek case is a great example. The mature industry might well be 2 or 3 companies with mega crunching power, and then sending out distilled energy efficient models for use in all kinds of day-to-day applications that take no energy at all. And that's a completely different deployment model. I mean, so I want to go to something Jon said. Why can't we wait and build renewables and batteries? It's not that much of a delay. They're cheaper. And these are the kinds of questions we want to ask. Let me say that from an organizing perspective, if you saw what happened with Bitcoin, there started to be state legislation that they snuck in to keep Bitcoin generators from being regulated. And AI has a much more powerful driver intellectually, economically than that.
It has
We're
use
a juggernaut.
cases.
Go ahead. Yeah.
It has use cases other than criminality, which is mainly what Bitcoin
Absolutely.
is
It's
good
got
for.
pretty good use cases. So it's very hard to go head to head against AI per se, although we've given some reasons to do so here. The fear from an organizing perspective is not only can they go to state legislatures and try to ram things through, but there may well be federal national security imperatives put in. So I think some of the thinking and organizing has to happen coalitionally about all the kind of leakage points that could go in, in an environment where the ruling party, the leading politicians in our country today talk about burn, baby, burn. And you see the fossil industry riding that coattail and the nuclear industry riding that coattail in as well. It's important to note, for example, that only 8% of projected electricity growth in the next 5 years is projected to be in the tech sector. You think about a world that's swapping off of fossil fuels, we're electrifying vehicles, households, industry. Only 8% globally over the next 5 years is projected to be in the tech sector. The other thing from a macro perspective is there's a theory in environmental economics called Coase theorem, and it's taught because it's so wrong. And one of the ways it's wrong is that polluters overstate all the time. That is expected in economic behavior, that a polluter is going to say, I'm the boogeyman, I'm building a really big pipe so that the price of regulation goes down off the threat of how much they need. It's classic. It's a 50, 75-year-old economics rule that know that polluters are going to overstate. They double count, as Jon has said. They moved in the case he gave from California to Nevada, a much laxer regulatory environment after making California jump through hoops. There are different business models that may eventually do this, and it's a stalking horse for other industries like the nuclear industry and the fossil fuel industry. So we really have to, there's a lot to unpack here, and I want to thank the speakers so far. I'll make one other thing, and I want to talk a little bit about solutions and opportunities. One of our advisors is Jigar Shah at the center is a guy named Jigar Shah, who invented the solar PPA. He invented the way in which solar facilities are mostly funded these days, and then ran the loan program office of the Department of Energy under the Biden administration. And the work they did at the Department of Energy showed that 20% demand response in most markets solves the hyperscalers' need for energy. Meaning, if we fund communities, including EJ communities, to put demand response systems in place, to just adjust load depending on when peak is going to hit, we can do this with community demand response and community efficiency and community power in ways that actually remunerate communities and reduce pollution. And we can pay in environmental justice communities and low-income communities money to do this. Please have your washing machine turned off at a certain hour of the day, period. And here's some money, by the way, because we didn't have to build a giant facility to power this hyperscaling power plant. 20% penetration of demand response solves the grid problems that we're facing. And that's an official DOE study. So there's all kinds of other ways to solve this and to address it that build local economies, build resilience, reduce pollution. So with that said, I want to turn a little bit to the solutions. We're thinking about a follow-up to this with a wonderful new group called Power Lines. Charles Hua, who's just been named to the Time 100 list recently for his work. But they're focusing specifically on public utility commission politics in 50 states just because those places have to be democratized. We have to get the fossil fuels out of the mindset of our utility commissions. I know everybody who ever ran a power company knows how to build a power plant, and that's not what we need to be building anymore. We need to be building solar, renewables, batteries, efficiency. So there's a lot of politics and organizing around that. So our center, as I mentioned earlier, believes that AI can be a source of power for our communities, can be a source of power, not energy, political power. But there are challenges in the pace of deployment, and it can't be at the expense of our lives and environment. So we're going to go to questions in about 5 more minutes. So please start putting your Q&A. We're going to accumulate them and call on some of you to talk about some of the archetypal questions. And we're actually going to try to have the last 10 minutes be just people being able to vent their concerns, their frustrations, their fears, not necessarily questions, but we'd like you to keep those short as well. We know there's a lot of angst and a lot of frontline work happening here. And we want to give voice to that and think about what we can do next as well. But to our speakers, in the face of the challenges on all these fronts, how can we focus our organizing? At what level can we play a more effective role in mitigating the harm from the false narratives and urgency? And are there any opportunities that you can identify for how can we use the kinds of tools you identify to build political power? Let's start with the first one. How should we focus our organizing? At what level can we play an effective role in mitigating these harms? I'll go to Justin first and then back to Jon. Thank you.
Yep. No, thank you for the question. Look, I believe in, I have to say, I work at the state level and I'm thinking about legislation going into this upcoming January in this session, dealing with AI, energy use, and getting clarity from companies that are entering into our state what their power needs or power demands or requests would be to the Tennessee Valley Authority or to our public utility in Memphis, MLG&W. So there's more need for transparency. I think that's something we can advocate for across a political spectrum, across our regions. And doing that, I think at the state level makes sense for my position. But a lot of organizing, it happens at community level. That being able to reach out to those city councilors, those county commissioners, those mayors is something that the more proximate you are, the more of an effect you're able to have. But I do think we need to hold elected officials who are accountable, who bring these projects to us or who have the responsibility for voting on them into the fold of this conversation earlier rather than later. And then also it's our utility boards. And that's why I'm excited about the folks that are coming next time. There's a lot of power at the local utilities, particularly for those with public power, to be able to say, hey, before you approve this project, or you say you're going to build another substation, or you're going to do this, you're going to do that, we need to have a much more serious discussion about what that means for our energy rates, what that means for rolling blackouts potentially, or periods of peak demand. And that's a place where even in Memphis, we're really starting to turn our attention to, because the CEO has really become a private owner rather than the leader of a public utility. Jon, what do you think?
You're on mute, Jon.
I would say two things. One is Michael mentioned that public utilities commissions are an important lever for doing something about this. And in some places, public utilities commissioners are elected. And I suspect that a lot of people don't even pay attention to those elections. But those turn out to be really important. If you care about climate, if you care about the energy transition, if you care about energy justice, environmental justice, that really focusing on those races and trying to educate people to come out and do something about that is critical to making this happen, because that power imbalance is not going away. At least you can start to put good people in those positions who can start to, because they have power, they just don't always want to use it because they're whatever. So the other thing is, in a lot of places, there are co-ops, utility co-ops. There's municipal utilities. Normally when you think of utilities, you think of the big investor-owned utilities, but there are thousands of these co-ops and municipal utilities that are very small entities. They cover cities, or they cover some small rural area. These are places where local people can have a huge effect on how they make decisions. So I think it's really important for people to figure out where do I get my power? Who is responsible by electricity? Who is responsible for it? And if it's a local, a small rural co-op, go to the meetings, talk to people, because if you live there, your voice will carry weight. And so it's not for the big utilities, the state commission is important, but for these more local utilities, people can make a huge difference if they just speak up.
Great. Thank you so much. We're start taking questions. We're going to start calling on folks. One of the first questions is anonymous, so I'm not going to call on them, but I want to, let me just ask one interesting question before we do that real quick is, if you had to prioritize where to defend your community, where to go, where to attack, I think we've sort of answered this, but would you attack AI, or would you attack, or you would organize against AI, or would you organize against something else? Because I think that people are like trying to go head on to this. Maybe the problem's coming here. What's your view on that?
Well,
Jon,
think,
and then go ahead, Justin.
Yeah. You attack pollution, right? You attack overconsumption and unfair rates, right? Like my mom always says, the problem is the problem. AI existing in and of itself is not a problem. AI is a tool created by human beings, being used by human beings. Human beings then are the solution of the problem. And if humans are deciding to use fossil fuels to power these machines, to power these supercomputers, that's the problem, because that's impacting our air quality. If they aren't using the best cooling systems available, and they're using 1 million gallons of water a day to cool these machines. That's the problem. And so it isn't just AI, it's the humans who are running these companies who are refusing to prioritize human beings, right? And our lives and our health. That's the problem. And so that's how I think we address it. That's why we've been at the health department a lot. That's why we've been going to elected officials, talking about the cancer risk, talking about the levels of pollution, because that's our problem. It isn't so much AI, it's the things that are being used to power it that is hurting the lives of the people around it.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. One more thing about this is, I think one of the key levers is to question the sense of urgency. Because I think that they create this sense of urgency. They say, oh, we're going to compete with China, or we have to get to this general intelligence or whatever it is, computer from Star Trek. But the idea is to say, well, why do we need to abandon our other goals to do that? Why is this so important? And I don't think they have a very good answer for that. That, as Michael was saying, there's a kind of internal imperative for these companies because they want to be first past the post. They think if they, are the fastest, biggest, most, powerful in terms of compute, that they'll be winners. Okay, so that's their imperative, but that doesn't mean that we as a society should take that as an imperative. And I still don't understand why people are just letting that presumption go unchallenged, because I don't understand the sense of urgency at all. And it's, again, I think of things from society's perspective, and from society's perspective there is not a sense of urgency. It might take another year or two. I feel like they should be, these companies have been pretty good recently in the last 10, 15 years on building new renewable power. We should just say to them, you can do AI, but you also need to build zero emissions power if you want to do it. And that's, again, it's a regulatory failure that we're not forcing them to just build clean power. They've got all the money in the world. They should be doing it.
Don said to me the other day, it makes no sense for the richest companies in the world to pay less for their energy than consumers and people. They make a lot of money. So with that, I want to turn to questions. What we're going to do is take questions for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then I'm going to show you again one more time some of the tools we've been building with AI to build power for communities, like actually help communities be more powerful in the face of polluters and climate change. But we have our first questions from an anonymous person, and then we'll return to Maria Paselo, Esther Sosa, Carolyn Pars, and Macario Sarsoso. So just get ready to get called on because we want to hear some other voices too. So yes, here in Indianapolis, a startup is proposing a modular center in a neighborhood that has been devastated by extractive entities polluting the area. We know they're not being transparent with their plans. Also, at times, commitments are not worth the paper they are written on. Any suggestions on how to expose the fallacy of community commitments or benefits?
Yeah, I mean, one, you demand transparency. I think that is the thing. And if you are not getting it as a community, tell your elected officials or whoever they're coordinating with to demand transparency. And like, honestly, it's unfortunate, but our community has 18 toxic release inventory facilities. We've defeated several that have tried to come in here, including the crude oil pipeline company, and Sterilization Services of Tennessee closed its doors. But when you are in overburdened communities, the struggle and the fight is always there. The truth is, in our lived experiences, we know the answers. And I think for that community, it's a similar thing. Look, when have any of these companies ever done what they said they were going to do? Because this isn't the first one to promise the moon, right? And I think just speaking that truth into your neighborhood, speaking that truth on your street, speaking that truth to elected leaders is important, because it isn't something that they're likely to follow through on. But demand the people who are elected, like your representatives, to ask the questions, to send in the request, to get answers from these companies.
Yeah, so transparency is critical. It's a critical lever. I think that there are tools that even individuals can use. The Freedom of Information Act can be helpful. Not always, but in certain kinds of processes, you can learn things about projects like this, even though certain things are confidential. Like, for example, for a project I was working on, we used Freedom of Information Act requests to get information about which industrial facilities use reclaimed water from wastewater. And we sent in a request. It wasn't quite stated properly, so like, we can't answer that. But then we restated it, and they said, oh yeah, this facility does, this facility doesn't. So if you can find sources of information, Freedom of Information Act is one thing, but there's other ways to kind of do the detective work. And for transparency, someone's got to do the detective work, right? You have to show what's happening so that people can respond to it. So I would say, use all the tools that you have to find out what's actually happening and share it with your neighbors and with your elected officials, and get them to, address real issues that are coming from these installations.
Great. I'm going to now go and recognize some voices of the people who did. I know Maria Pacelo. Axel, can you unmute her and ask them to ask their question? Maria, are you there?
I think she's in the chat. She said we answered her question.
Oh, we answered it. Okay, great. Esther, you're next, and then Carolyn after that. Esther Sosa, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, speak up a little bit more.
Thank you so much for your time.
And where are you from? Tell us who you are. Thanks.
Yeah, Esther Sosa from Brooklyn. I used to work at EPA. And I have three-part question. The first is for Representative Justin, and that is on how you saw the XAI data center influence or impact the energy prices that your community paid over the last year that it's been in operation. And then the second two-piece question is, how do you then regulate after a facility has been put in place? What are the levers available to help us influence or regulate facilities after a facility like XAI has been built and is operating? And then what resources can we offer to legislators, assuming that they're operating in good faith, to help them make these very complicated decisions about whether to build data centers and what questions to ask and how to negotiate what happens for these centers?
Thank you, Esther. Carolyn Pars, you're up next. Go ahead, Justin and John, please.
Okay. Yeah, I think we haven't seen a very marked increase yet in our energy cost. That being said, because a lot of our energy comes from fossil fuels and the Tennessee Valley Authority, they're able to fluctuate costs sort of at a whim. And so that is a concern. But we didn't see like it go from, $1 to $1,000 sort of overnight to pay for XAI's operations. The thing is, they did just build 2 new substations, and so we'll see what that means when they are completely on the grid compared to going directly to TVA. I think when it comes to, how do you regulate facilities after they're there, it is looking at what requires regulation. If they're polluting the air, it requires regulation. If they are using the water, it requires regulation. And which means there are regulators who you have influence on, because they have to get permits to do these things. They have to get permits to build. They have to get permits to operate. And those are opportunities for community members to be able to say something, to be able to get their voice, their opinions heard and known. And then sort of to your last question, what do you get to legislators? The first ask for people who are legislators is, can you get more transparency and information? We're actually currently, this isn't public yet, but we're working on 3 laws locally, just targeting more transparency for high energy industries. We're not even targeting data centers specifically. If you're using this amount of water, you're using this amount of power, we need some more information, right? I think it's 5 megawatts. We need more information about what you're doing, how long you're going to be doing, and what the implications are for the environment. The demand for all elected people is to get more information, because the more information we have, the better decisions that we can make. And we can use information like John sharing to have our utilities really do an analysis to say, is this possible? Is this feasible? Can our grid take this? And if not, we're going to have to let them know we can't.
So I would just say, add 2 things to what you said, Justin. I agree with everything you said. One is that there are rules at the state level for how utilities allocate costs. So when they do a rate making proceeding, they come up with these rules to say, you know, in the best case, they say, well, if you're imposing this cost on the system, you pay this cost. But in practice, there's a kind of political trading that goes on, and they try to keep residential rates lower, but they don't want to have industry rates to be too high because then the industry leaves. And so there's a bunch of political trading that happens. But it sounds kind of boring, but cost allocation in the utility industry is actually really important for this. And if new facilities are causing electricity prices to go up for everyone, the question is, why should that be? Like, why should we be paying for that? Why should grandma have to pay a higher bill because the politicians decided to have a big data center facility come in? So I think it comes back to those public utilities elections, but also it comes back to local interveners who know the utility system and who are kind of, in some cases, gadflies, but in a lot of cases, they're technical people who actually dig into these things. So in Virginia, one of the graphs that I showed was from one of those interveners. There are presumably local groups who are expert in these cost allocation issues, these forecasting issues that can kind of give some insight into how to challenge these kinds of decisions that mostly fly under the radar for most people. They think, oh, I don't understand that, whatever. But it's really important. It's boring, but important. The other thing I would add quickly is that there's a lot of new technology for measuring pollution. So we're starting to be able to measure pollution using satellite data and using data, just handheld devices where you can point it at something and see, oh, that's methane, right? And so I think that that's something that anybody could do. Anybody could get one of those little meters. Maybe it costs a few $100, but you could get one of those cameras that tell you what's being emitted, and then you could say, well, I went to that facility and here's what my camera says. And that is enough information, presumably, to get people to start thinking about it. So I would encourage everyone to think about new ways to kind of create transparency by measuring what's happening, because measurement is one of those things that everyone has to respond to. It's just like it's a picture, it's a measurement, it's a real thing.
Yeah, there was a movement in the early days of the EJ, not early, but mid EJ movement called the bucket brigades, where people learned how to do air toxics monitoring in basically home kits and there was peer review showing how valuable they were. A lot more tools out there now to monitor this stuff. So thank you very much. Okay, we're going to move to Carolyn Pars, who has a question. Carolyn, you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and help us out. Thank you for the question, Esther. And tell us who you are, Carolyn.
Hi, Carolyn. Carolyn here. From the Just Power podcast, and we do a lot of talking about this subject on our podcast. And I was a bit confused about what you said, Michael, about at 8% coming from growth coming from tech, only 8%, and it might be the difference between what I heard is like as far as energy consumption, that 12% or more in the coming years is going to be because of the data centers that are coming online, that they can't get online fast enough. So that's one thing, which is huge amount, right? And I live in the Denver area, and there's a data center that's happening in Texas right now that is rivaling how much energy we use in all of the Denver metro area. So that's the one question I have. And the second part to that, Jonathan did touch on, and it's a really big issue, is the whole affordability of all of this. In Colorado, upwards of 40% our rates will go up in the next 5 years. And that's what I heard from Energy Outreach Colorado, which is a very big nonprofit. And this is not being talked about very much, right? Definitely, it's until it hits, I think, everybody, not just low, but moderate and upwards of income families. So that is just as much as the environmental implications, the affordability implications on what's going is huge. And we're all going to see it pretty darn soon.
Yeah. So let me, I'll want to ask John to answer that specifically, but again, false narratives, false urgency. This is a softening tech. This is every polluter in history has softened up the targets by overclaiming, by saying I'm a big bag booty man and I got to happen. And I just would urge you, the head of XAI, the head of Google, the head of OpenAI are not energy experts. Their job is to get cheap energy for their industry, even and their job is to soften up regulatory opposition and commercial and pricing opposition. They actually don't know the details, and there is a lot of false stuff going down. I'll share a couple resources in the link. I put together actually an AI that has read a lot of stuff here that you can ask questions of around this. But John is a living expert here, and I want you to, if you could just answer some of these questions about that. So again, just don't believe the hype is an important piece
Yeah,
here.
so I think that any statistic that you hear, you need to verify, because there's a long established tendency of people, even credible people, repeating numbers that are just not correct and not verified. There's a fascination with gee whiz statistics, and it's very easy to create gee whiz statistics. That's the great thing about it, is that, you know, we're dealing with people who can do very simple extrapolations, and then they say, I calculated this number, but it doesn't mean anything, right? So let's go back to some of the numbers that you asked about. So Michael's statistic, I believe, came from the IEA, International Energy Agency. They did the projections for the next few years of electrification of many different industries, and so that's where that 8% comes from. What I think I heard you say, though, you used the word 12%. I think you're talking about not the percentage of growth, but the percentage of electricity use associated with tech, right? And so that number is a projection. Nobody really knows how much electricity the data centers are going to use even a few years from now. Right now, as of 2023, we have a pretty good idea. It's in the kind of 4% range for the US, kind of 2% for the world. And so that's the number, right? And any other number is a projection that is subject to incredible uncertainty. No one has any idea. And so you really have to treat all of these projections of data centers using 12%, 20% of our electricity as basically just guesses, sometimes guesses by self-interested people. I've been studying this topic now for 30 years, more than 30 years. I was there during the tech, the dot-com boom, when people were talking about how the internet was going to use half of all of our electricity in 10 years. And so this is not a new thing, right? People make these claims all the time, and you really need to hold a microscope to them and really understand what they're claiming before jumping to any conclusions about it. Does that answer the question?
Yes, but so Jonathan, you've been in it for 30 years. What do you think?
What do I think about what?
Like
what
projections, like when you know all of these data centers that are coming online, you know, or wanting to, that number 12 is, I guess it's just a projection, right? Are you thinking that it's going to be lower than that, or do you have no idea?
Well, I think nobody has any idea. I think that that 12% is kind of a conventional wisdom sort of projection. So it assumes that demand for AI is infinite and they can build as many of these facilities as they can and so on. I think it's very likely to be lower than that, because I don't think they're going to get to build everything they think they're going to build. I think it's very likely that we will come up with new ways of delivering equivalent computing services that use orders of magnitude less energy.
Orders of magnitude. Remember, Koomey's law
Yes.
is
So
that the
sorry,
energy use
10.
of
No.
this.
Okay.
Koomey's law is that this stuff
this
is the energy consumption is half every 2 years, and that's
okay.
up to
Well, that's a
projection.
separate. Okay,
No,
that's separate.
I'm just reinforcing what you're saying, John. Is that this stuff is
Okay.
exponentially increasing in efficiency? Also, go ahead.
Right. And so, but we're also creating innovations like DeepSeek and ZAI that allow people to do the same thing using 10 or 100 times less energy. And so the assumption that we're going to get to from 4% to 12% assumes that we're going to follow this conventional wisdom path, and we're going to build all these giant data centers. We're going to keep scaling, and that's what the industry believes. But it's very likely, because technology changes so fast, as Michael was saying, that we'll come up with other clever ways to do this. And I think, that is something that is underestimated by the people making these conventional wisdom forecasts.
Okay, we're going to take one more
Thank you.
question in a second from Yosef Robele, but I want to just quickly say, if you want to stay in this dialogue, please take a look. I'm going to paste a link in for you to take a look at, and a survey rather that you can fill out, a form you can fill out to stay up to date on what we're doing. And also, frankly, I want to just quickly again show you a couple of tools. We have been at the Center for Environmental Justice trying to use building tools to build power for communities with AI. And I just want to show you one of those tools that we built globally, share with you, but that are basically meant to increase democratic participation in these kinds of decisions. This was built for everything you're looking at on this screen, and it's sharing now, right? Yeah. Was built by an AI. We have an AI that stands up AI for frontline climate justice communities. And it scrapes local media in 3 or 4 local languages, Hindi, Marathi, and English, and says to people in those, and helps organizers in those communities understand what happened, what caused it, who the key decision makers are, and what commitments those decision makers have made in the past. I'll give you a preview of what that looks like, for example, right here, where you can literally see a timeline of commitments that have been made by local governments in Mumbai about the flooding that those communities face all the time because of climate change. So you can use AI to just gather this information and really give people a leg up in the face of disasters they faced. They can mobilize more quickly with what elected officials have said. So there are positive uses for building power, which is why we also want to make sure that that stuff doesn't get abused, and why we're having this webinar. Last question from Yusuf. Can you unmute him, please, Alex? And thank you, everybody, for joining us. I'll paste the form in one more time if you want to stay in touch. We are looking for communities to use these, to test these tools with us in the struggles they're engaged in. These are meant to be your own tools. These are widgets that you can deploy on your own, so that they are your piece. So, Yusuf, have at it. Last question, please. Or are we doing Ashley Nicole? Is that?
Yeah, Yusuf might have hopped off, so we're going to get Ashley on.
Ashley, go ahead and ask your question, please. Thank you.
Hi, yeah, thank you. I'm hoping that you can address the impact on water required for hyperscale AI data centers. I know you're expressing its neutrality, but I think it's really important to also talk about the actual impact, specifically the volume and amount required to cool the data centers, which is required 24 hours a day, and the fact that this water used to cool these centers, there isn't currently the technology that makes this water safe to be returned to the hydrologic cycle and to become potable. So I just think it'd be really helpful if you could address that.
Thank you, Ashley. Jon,
So
or
I was just at the WEFTech conference, which is the conference of the water utilities, and I was talking about exactly this topic. It's a pretty complex area. One of the things that makes it complicated is that the technologies for using water vary a huge amount. So we have some technologies for cooling data centers that use no on-site water. And then there are some that are kind of in the middle, where they spray water into the air. And it turns out, certainly in a dry climate, if you spray water in the air, it reduces the temperature. That's super water efficient to do that. And then on the other end, we have cooling towers where you're basically boiling water to get rid of heat. And that's the heat of evaporation, 540 calories per gram. That's the highest water use. And so in terms of reported water use from the hyperscale facilities, there's a range of like a factor of 9 between the lowest and the highest. And so just understanding that technology difference turns out to be pretty important. Some of these companies are starting to use reclaimed water, and this is reclaimed municipal wastewater. This is wastewater that comes out of the sewage treatment plant that's been purified enough that they can use it for the cooling, either cooling towers or spraying it into the air. So there's that whole range here that's important. There are better or less water intensive and more water intensive ways to do it. So that's a question that people can ask. It's like, well, what kind of cooling are you going to use? How much water are you going to use cooling towers? Are you going to do this other thing? The Lawrence Berkeley Lab report that I alluded to talks about these different ways of doing the cooling. So if you wanted to get a high level picture of that, that would be a very useful thing. The other important thing to understand, though, is that there's on-site water use for the data center, and then there's water use in the utility system. Because if you generate electricity from a steam plant, you need water. You have to boil water. And it turns out that coal plants, oil plants, natural gas combined cycle plants use water. And that embedded water in the system turns out to be really, really important. So if you force people to use an on-site technology that uses no water on site, but it's less efficient, you're using more water in the utility system. So anyway, it's a complex area. There are certainly ways that these facilities can use a lot less water, and they can be using reclaimed water. So you can ask questions about the kind of cooling that they're going to be doing. And, if you're in a water sensitive area and they're using potable water, you can certainly make a specific demand. It's like, we really want you to use this other way that uses a lot less water. So anyway, it's a complicated area. So I wanted to get the context.
In Memphis, we do have a water reuse facility that XAI has said they're planning to build. They started some of that, but the idea is that they'd use gray water that goes down the toilet, down the sink, and is used for the cooling of their plant, as well as the combined cycle plant and Nucor Steel Corporation, which each use 1 million gallons of water a day, over 1 million gallons of water a day. And so I think that has to be a demand for their existence. You need to have clean energy, and you need to be using reusable water instead of using fresh drinking water.
Yeah, and the thing about the reclaimed water from municipal sources is that everywhere there are people, there is sewage treatment plants, and there's plenty of water. Right? You don't need to use aquifers. You don't need to use potable water in most places, and so it's really that's a demand. That's something you can say, hey, we really want you to use reclaimed water. Get to it.
All right, Axel's gonna put up a slide about our upcoming Environmental Joy Conference. We have a global conference every year, October 31st, November 1st. We're hoping Rep. Pearson will be there, but a bunch of superstars will join us. Then Axel's gonna put a slide up. You can go to bit.ly/, but Google Environmental Joy and you'll find us. Please come to the conference and join us. We're going to be writing the future. It's a Congress actually this year, not a conference, and we're going to be talking about a lot of issues and how the world should be moving forward out of this moment. Listen, we're all in a little bit of shock when the most powerful industries in the world talk about how much they need nuclear power and bad diesel generators in our communities and want to use all the water in the world. A lot of the comments so far, people are still incredulous. Like, wait, Sam Altman said this or Eric Schmidt said that. False narratives, false urgency. We're going to continue to try to promote dialogue and help people learn what to focus on, how learn from others in the field, what's been effective, how to focus on this stuff, and to lose that illusion, that hypnosis that's happening with AI, and get to the nuts and bolts about ethical uses of AI, the environmental impacts, energy impacts, the truth, and why some of the richest companies in the world, who until recently were acting very environmentally, should continue to do so that we can have progress that's sustainable for everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Come to the Environmental Joy Conference if you can. Sign up. Thanks to Representative Pearson, Jon Koomey. These are the superstars in the field today. We thank you. We're going to try to have more superstars from communities and from frontline communities working on this as well. Thanks, everyone. We're wrapping up, and have a great rest of the day. Take care.